Hi everyone, welcome back to my basement. So today we are going to start on chapter 31. What this is the Roaring Twenties. And the Roaring Twenties, the 1920s, is a very dynamic period. And much of that is credited to what happened as a result of World War One, right? So if we were to look at this period, span it over the decade, and we use Persia, and we start with politically, the changes that take place there after World War One, America turned inward. We didn't really want to embrace the efforts or the idealism of Woodrow Wilson and his 14 points and a whole new world order. Instead, government wanted to turn inward. Americans wanted to turn inward. And so we did that. We're also fearful of the spread of communism here in the United States following the Communist Revolution in Russia in 1917. So we get our first Red Scare here in the United States. And as you recall from contemporary American history, the second one is going to be in the 1950s. Also, because of the fact that we kind of isolated ourselves, we turned back immigration, right? Immigrants coming into the country. And so we're going to get landmark immigration reform in 1921 and then again in 1924. Economically, this is a period of vast, rapid economic growth. America is mass producing all sorts of new products, most specifically the automobile. And from that stimulates a lot of other things. Wages are increasing. We just get a huge boom at this time. Women are entering the workforce in larger numbers as well. When we go to our religion, religion is displayed mostly in this time period through the Scopes trial, where fundamentalism is challenged, but we see that Christian fundamentalism is alive and well and actually thriving in the United States. So the Scopes trial is very significant in American history for looking at that. Where they challenge not social Darwinism, excuse me, Darwin's belief in natural selection and the theory of evolution. All right, for social changes, those are numerous, right? Especially there for women and African American and Americans in the United States. For women, there's this newfound freedom. Part of it came from World War One because women entered the workforce in larger numbers, but also because women got the right to vote in 1920, and so they feel empowered. So we're going to kind of get this new woman who is embodied in the flapper. This woman has all this freedom. She cuts her hair short, she wears certain clothing, acts a certain way, right? So there's that. For African Americans, they too were impacted by World War One in the sense that those people who went off to fight. They were fighting for democracy abroad, but when they came home, they wanted it here. They wanted to fight for their own freedoms. And so we're going to get some changes there. Most notably, we're going to get the Great Migration, where millions of Black people finally leave the oppressive South and they're searching for these jobs in northern cities. That's going to have some impact too, some positive, some negative. The positive aspect of it is that this kind of builds the seeds for the civil rights movement. It's going to take about another 30, 40 years before we start to see that really come to fruition, but the seeds are planted in this time period, right? Also, with the Great Migration, as Black people go into northern cities, there's going to be some negative ramifications, and that is that it's going to stir up some racial tension in those cities. All right, so another big social change, of course, is Prohibition. Americans just pretty much outwardly just ignore the law in many places, mostly in eastern cities. They have speakeasies that run just as bars would have prior to Prohibition being ratified. So that kind of covers social for now. But then there's also intellectual and artistic. Intellectually, there's all sorts of new discoveries, inventions, just kind of a flowering of that scientific research. But artistically, we're going to get the Harlem Renaissance, and this is an outpouring of art and culture within the Black community that's centered around the neighborhood of Harlem in New York City. And then also we get a group of people who challenge the materialism of the 1920s. They're kind of like the transcendentalists in the in the antebellum period, and and then you get kind of like the hippies that are going to be in like the Beats, and then the hippies in the 1950s, 1960s. This is known as the lost generation, and they get an outpouring of literature during that time. So anyway, let's get started. In this section, I've broken it up where we're just going to talk, and it's based on how the book did the order. So we're going to have the Red Scare, Prohibition, and Great Migration, the main things that we're going to cover in this section. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay, I love this picture, American life in the 1920s, and here you have four flappers, right, dancing. They've cut their hair short, very different from women in the Victorian age. Oh, and I threw in George and Agnes. These are my fraternal grandparents. George is second generation Irish. He did go to college, small little college called Lombard College that doesn't exist anymore in Galesburg, Illinois. And he met Agnes Wessels. They married, had four children. Agnes was kind of a wild child. She was a flapper. She ended up divorcing him, and during the Great Depression raised four kids. George went on to marry Ruth, lived in Colorado, and worked in the Mint, the Denver Mint. But anyway, these two got married in the 1920s, right? My dad was born in 1931. So it's just kind of, it's interesting how they always used to talk about the 1920s and the Roaring 20s, and pretty much how happy they were during that time period. Okay, so here are some characteristics over here on the left, the 4 bullet points. So America kind of, after this crusading idealism of World War II, they turn inward. We're going to get the Red Scare, so there's a fear of radicals and foreigners coming into the country. It is very prosperous, and there is a change in our cultural values. Okay, so the first of those characteristics, we talk about isolationism and intolerance. And again, this has to do with the fear of communism. And so we enter into the Red Scare where we're searching out these communists in our country. There's also, this plays into the rise of the KKK because they are anti-communist, anti-foreigners, that sort of thing. So their membership is going to skyrocket. And then so what that's going to equate to are immigration restrictions with the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 and the Emergency Act of 1924, or I'm sorry, the Immigration Act of 1924. Okay, so this cartoon you're going to see again, but what this indicates, you can see on the hat of the character, it says Reds. He's got a knife there. He's coming in, sneaking into the United States. It says Bolshevik, and then kind of spreading this anarchy. So this is what Americans were fearful of. And so this reflected poorly, right, on people within the United States who had a tendency to be on the left, labor unions, socialists, anarchists, communists. There's a real fear there. So really when people go on strike, as you can see right here, there's the Seattle strike. The mayor, I believe it was the police force in Seattle, they went on strike. The mayor sends in federal troops to put down the anarchy, right? So this is kind of indicative of that fear that is taking place during this time period. It was also encouraged by other people. The radio became very popular, a medium to get the news and entertainment. People would sit around their living rooms and listen to the news or entertainment shows. This guy right here, Billy Sunday, he was a baseball player, also an evangelical preacher, and he had a radio show, and he talked about the perils of communism and the fear of communists in the United States. And as you can see, a quote from him: "If I'd had my way, I'd fill the jail so full of them that their feet would stick out the windows." I guess it's supposed to be funny. So anyway, there's a hunt for these communists, right? Anybody who is suspected of being a communist. Up here on the top right, this is Mitchell Palmer. I think his first name is Andrew or A. Mitchell Palmer or something like that. But anyway, he was appointed by Woodrow Wilson to be the Attorney General after World War I. He was a Quaker, and he really went after communists with a vengeance, right? So he's called the Fighting Quaker. He created, within this new bureau, the Bureau of Investigations, which would later become the FBI, the General Intelligence Division, and he appointed the very young J. Edgar Hoover, who is pictured on the bottom right. He's only 24 years old, as the head of this new division. He is going to serve as the head of the FBI from 1924 until 1972. He's going to be there for a very long time. I remember him. He's the director of the FBI when I was a kid, most of my childhood. But anyway, they use extra legal means to go after anybody who is suspected of being a communist. They did like 6,000 raids on people's homes in 1919, the Red Summer, right? And as a result of those raids, they deported about 500 foreign-born suspects, people who they believed to be anarchists. The problem with this is, in many cases, it was most likely a violation of their Fourth Amendment rights, violation of illegal search and seizure, but they did it, as I said, from extra legal means. Here is an image of material seized after one of those raids, one of those Palmer raids. Okay, so here what you see on top is a cartoon, and it's a ship. It's supposed to be a ship, the USS Buford. The Buford was part ocean liner, part cargo ship, and it was used to deport about 249 non-citizens to Russia, right? These are people who were believed to be anarchists, and they had syndicalist political beliefs, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. The media who was on site, they called it the Soviet Ark or the Red Ark. The woman pictured at the bottom left, this is Emma Goldman. She was born in Russia, but she immigrated here to the United States, and she advocated ideas such as anarchy and communism and socialism, and she and her lover plotted the death of Henry Clay Frick. She went to jail for that. Frick, you may recall, was the partner of Andrew Carnegie, and he played a huge role in the Homestead Steel Strike. He was the business part of that strike and put down the strikers. So she was also imprisoned as a violation of the Espionage Act during World War I because she gave speeches and distributed leaflets trying to encourage people not to abide by the draft. Once she was deported back to Russia, she was critical of the Soviet Union and the Communist Party there because they would not allow freedom of speech. And she thought that was wrong. So I'm not sure if this was a response to the raids or the raids were a response to this, but there was justification for a fear of some people in the United States because terrorist activity was taking place, right? In 1919, the government discovered a plot to bomb A. Mitchell Palmer's home, right? They never really found out who did it. They defused the bomb, but it was linked to a group of supporters who followed an Italian anarchist by the name of Luigi Galliani, and these people were called Gallianists, right? So even though that first one was detected, as you can see there, the main second bullet point, there were second bombs that went off. One at A. Mitchell Palmer's home. It exploded on the front porch, and that's the image here to the right. You can see that it did significant damage to his home in Washington, D.C. After that, some people called him the Quaking Fighter instead of the Fighting Quaker. It wasn't just him, though. There were 34 other dynamite-filled bombs that were mailed out in April of 1919. It went out to leading government officials, people who were in the justice officials, judges, newspaper editors, and even John D. Rockefeller. He was targeted as well. Altogether, there were about 6,000 different suspects. Okay, so as I told you, we were going to talk about syndicalism. So syndicalism is defined, as it says right here, any belief you have to try to overthrow a government, where you transfer the power from one group of people to another through crime, sabotage, violence, or anything like that, right? So this was supported by certain groups within the United States, some people who advocated for communism or socialism, where they wanted the government to take over the means of production. One group would have been the Wobblies, which the International Workers of the World, which was established by Eugene Debs, right? So a lot of states, to combat this, they created certain laws. These were called syndicalism laws, right? They were very similar to like the Espionage Act or the Sedition Act. Here's another example of violence that took place during this time period. On September 16th, 1920, a bomb went off on Wall Street. Right away, 38 people were killed. Actually, 37 were killed. One died later. 143 people were seriously injured, and hundreds of others were injured as well. I'm told today that you can still see evidence of this bombing on Wall Street if you go there. I guess you just have to know what to look for. But anyway, no one really knows for sure who the culprits were. They were never caught, but again, it was believed that they were linked to the Italian anarchist Luigi Galliani. Here is a very unfortunate incident in American history because of the fear that prevailed in America of foreigners and anarchists and people who were different at that time. Um, there were two people, Sacco and Vanzetti, who most likely were convicted of murder for a crime that they didn't commit. There was a man who was a paymaster at a shoe factory. And back then, you would take all the money and you would pay the people for the work right there on the spot. So this man went and he had a guard. Well, the guard and the paymaster were both killed. And somebody said, well, there were two Italians who did it. So these two kind of fit the bill. They're Sacco and Vanzetti. They're Italian. They were draft dodgers, anarchists, atheists, and so they were arrested and tried for the crime and found guilty. In the meantime, there was another individual who had confessed to the crime, but the Supreme Court in Massachusetts said, well, we don't want to upset the ruling, and so they didn't, and so these two were put to death, and most likely, many historians believe they did not commit the crime. But it just shows the sort of the mood at the time, the fear at the time, where Americans were willing to sacrifice our judicial system and our judicial beliefs and our beliefs in fairness in the law in order to put these people to death, right? So we kind of turn a blind eye to that at this time. It also shows the racism and those notions at that time as well. Okay, so in this climate of fear and anxiety and hatred, we see the rise of the KKK. The KKK had started about 50 years before, during the Civil War and Reconstruction, and then it had died out. But then there was this film in 1915 that was produced by D.W. Griffin, which everybody says it was a spectacular film. It was the first epic film made in the United States. Well, anyway, what it did, it was epic in the sense that it portrayed events from the Civil War through Reconstruction and then after, and it kind of showed how, the KKK needed to rise up to combat the way that there was a loss of civility within the South as a result of the fact that Black people had more freedom and control and power in the South. And so with white people having to give up so much power, they needed to assert themselves again, and the KKK kind of came in as the hero of the story. So in the movie, and you could see a clip or actually an image of it right here, the KKK is dressed in these hoods and that sort of thing, and then the black individual right here was captured by him. Well, this black man, who's really a white man in blackface, attacked a white woman, right? So you wouldn't have a real black man in 1950 actually touch a white woman. So many of the characters who portrayed black people in the movie were actually white people in blackface. So anyway, this came out and it was a huge hit. Woodrow Wilson was very closely linked with the producer or the director in this, and he screened it in the White House, and you can see a quote from him here. It says, "It is like writing history with lightning, and my only regret is that it is all so terribly true." Keep in mind that Woodrow Wilson was a history professor, right? So these are the beliefs that he held. So anyway, because of the racial tension after World War I and the Red Scare, this kind of helped kind of fuel the fire for the rise of the KK. So this guy, Joseph Simmons, who had been in charge of another fraternal organization in recruiting members, he's the one that started this. He goes up on Stone Mountain and he lights a cross on fire. I believe this is Tennessee. And he restarts the KKK and expanded throughout the United States. And it's estimated that by 1924, there were 6 million people in the United States, not just in the South, who were members of the KKK. So this image here I put in to show you just the sheer numbers of the Klan. Right here, this is a Klan march, and as you can see, I put a little bit of information down here. September 13th, 1926, there's about 30,000 Klansmen that showed up, and women, to this huge march in Washington, D.C. On the next slide, you'll see some other images of that same march. Anyway, too, here, this kind of lists some of the beliefs of the Klans people. So in general, you're okay if you're white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant. But if you're anything else, you're not, right? Or if you if you're WASP and you think differently, then you're not okay. So they're for Native Americans, and by that we don't mean Indians. We mean white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So they're pro-Protestant. So if you were a Christian, but you were Catholic, you're not okay. It had to be after the Protestant Reformation and people who followed challenges to the Catholic Church. So pro-Anglo-Saxon, people in Northern Europe, anti-Black, anti-Jew, anti-Catholic, anti-pacifist. Those are people who are opposed to the United States when at war. Anti-communist, anti-revolutionary, meaning anarchist. They're opposed to bootlegging, and so were women, so they were pro-feminist, which was kind of weird. Many people would think that that was not the case. They're anti-gambling and anti-adultery and anti-birth control. So they're all of these things, and they bill themselves as the protector of white womanhood in America. But what brought down the Klan is that the head of the KKK in Indiana, he went on a date with a woman. Her name was Marge Oberholtz, right? And even though they're opposed to drinking, he got really drunk, and he sexually assaulted this woman. Not only that, he took chunks of her, bit pieces of flesh out of her, and she ended up dying. But before she died, she kind of gave a confession or she told what happened. She gave her story to investigators about what happened. He didn't think he could be touched because he thought he was so powerful. And then when people who were in leadership roles didn't come out to defend him, he sent all this information away, and that kind of helped to bring about the downfall of the KKK, at least in Indiana, and then that trickled down to other locations as well. It would have another surge during the civil rights movement of the 1960s, but it's been dying out ever since then. So here are two other images I wanted to show you. The one on the left, I wanted to show you just the sheer scope and the density, the numbers that they had at this march in DC. And then the other one, ironically, here, the cross. Look at the crowds who came out to watch this. So you just have to wonder what was going on. Well, I'm telling you what was going on at this time. People were very racist, very xenophobic, opposed to anybody who wasn't white Anglo-Saxon American. All right, so along with this, because we had these huge swells of immigrants coming into the country, they wanted to cut that. I want you to look at the numbers here about 1900. Now the numbers, if you look, there's about 10 million people coming into the country, but that equaled about 14.8% of our total population. That was huge. The rate at which people were coming at that time is higher than what it is today. Back in 2012, which is the best one that I could find, it was like 13% of the population, and you could see that immigration was a big issue, especially in the election of 2016, and it continues to be a highly contested issue in the United States today. But the volume, the numbers weren't even as high. They were nearly as high, but not as high as they are today, because the population, the percentage of the population that the immigration population made up. Okay, here it shows it just in terms of the numbers, right? So 1900, 1910, it really peaked. But notice from 1921, 1931, it really declines dramatically, and that's because laws that are passed in the United States to halt immigration to our country. Okay, so this is the first one. This is the Emergency Quota Act, right? And you could see this by the cartoon on the right. So you got all these people wanting to come over from Europe, and Uncle Sam is imposing this gate. You only get 3%. So the way that this worked is that if you took the whole population of the United States and you look at the demographic makeup of it and you determine what percent or what number is German, what number is Irish, what number is Italian, and then that 3% of that number could then come into the United States. So what this was a way of doing some social engineering to ensure that we maintain the same ethnic makeup in the United States that it had, at least because here it was from the 1910 census. So let's go through this step by step. So first bullet point, we wanted to encourage, halt people coming in because of the fear of communism, right? It is drawn upon eugenics because there was some study done through this commission which came out and said that white people are superior to other races or ethnic groups of people. We've talked about eugenics in the past, so that shouldn't be anything new to you. Congress and the White House were kind of pushing for immigration restriction, so that's why it came about. This was meant to be a temporary measure to scientifically impose these quotas on people coming in. So it was 3% based on the 1910 census, right? So it was an approach to immigration to immediately impact the numbers coming in, right? So this was a 1921 political cartoon, and it was 1921 when the act was passed. But then that wasn't seen as good enough. So in 1924, this is known as the National Origins Act. It's also the Immigration Act of 1924. This is going to make the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 more stringent, right? So instead of 3%, it's 2%. And instead of the 1910 census, when population was more diverse, it's going to go back to the 1890 census when it was whiter. You know, not so many people from Southern and Eastern Europe. Also, this one was expanded to forbid Japanese people from coming. So what this did is it made it virtually impossible for anyone from East Asia to come to the United States because we already had the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Right? Canadians and Mexicans were exempt from this, and it wasn't abolished until 1965, and that's when immigration skyrockets. All right, so there are different points of view on immigration. Some people think that we need to be more inclusive and more diverse in the country. The belief had always been the top one, the melting pot, right? That everybody comes in and we all get stirred up together. We all speak the same language, share the same customs, traditions, and belief system. We have a consensus. Others believe that we should be more like a tossed salad, where, you know, like the tomato, the onion, the lettuce, everybody has its own flavor, right? So there's different belief systems here, and people wrote about it at the time. Horace Callum, right here, pluralism. He defended the right of immigrants to practice traditional customs and to retain their own culture within the larger American society. And then Ralph Bourne, he's a writer from New Jersey. He advocated sort of this cross-cultural mix where you kind of adopt different beliefs from different things and we kind of get a whole new America, right? So we're really not, he rejected the melting pot though. That we could embrace other ideas, and it's more cosmopolitan because you share all these different ideas. So pluralism, you have a whole bunch of different groups of people. Cosmopolitan is we share everybody's sort of beliefs. In both cases, they're both still sort of cultural pluralism, more accepting to other ideas. All right, and then there is prohibition, right? Let's go ahead and hit this one. All right, so there was the temperance movement. We know that there was a temperance movement in the antebellum period, right? And this was back with the main groups, the American Temperance Society, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. This kind of slowed down as a result of the Civil War, right? Um, but then it started back up, and many people believe that alcohol was the root of all evil in society, right? Spousal, child abuse, poverty. Many industrialists believe that absenteeism at work, you're going to have sickness, you're going to have crime, all sorts of things because of this. So there's a big movement in the early part, well, the latter part of the 1900s, early or the latter part of the 1800s, early 1900s, to again push for a ban on alcohol or temperance, right? And the group really responsible for this was the Anti-Saloon League. They were different from the Women's Christians Temperance Union because they expanded and they were really, really good at advertising and publicity. And here is one of their posters, the saloon or your children, basically, is what it's saying, right? So you get a coalition of people who support this, right? As I said, you got industrialists, you also have the KKK, small town conservatives, Protestants, progressives, many progressives. The only people that really didn't go along with this, I mean, you have pockets here and there, but generally speaking, if we're looking at Eastern city dwellers, right? Because they really didn't shut this down, yet they had speakeasies and they violated the law. Okay, so here is the 18th Amendment. 23 of the 48 states had passed anti-saloon legislation, so the states were doing this themselves, right? So they went even further. They said, we're going to ban the manufacture of alcohol altogether. So in the midterm election, or actually, this one would have been a presidential election, there was a split between wets and dries, right? So you were either a wet person or a dry person, right? And then the dry, those people who favored prohibition, won 2/3 majority in Congress, right? Over wets in Congress. So it looked like the mood of the country was in favor of this. So the amendment was proposed in Congress, right? And it set this time limit. It was proposed in Congress in 1917, December 1917, and they put it out there to the states and they said you have 7 years before you ratify this. And that was the first time ever that there was a time limit put on this. They're going to do this with the Equal Rights Amendment too when it's reintroduced. But anyway, there were 46 of the 48 states. Remember, at this time, Alaska and Hawaii were not states that ratified it. Rhode Island and Connecticut were the two states that never did. So it went into effect a year after it was ratified to kind of give people, kind of allowed them to get ready for this because it shut a lot of businesses down, right? It didn't prohibit the consumption of alcohol. Here's what it did. So you can see here, after 1 year of the ratification of the article, the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors within the importation thereof into or the exportation thereof from the United States and all the territories subject to the jurisdiction thereof or thereof for beverage purposes is hereby prohibited. So you can't produce it, but it's very, very vague. So nobody really knew what it meant. Nobody knew how you're going to enforce it, what you could or couldn't do, right? Or if, there were any exceptions to the rule. So they passed the Volstead Act. It's named after this guy right over here. He's the head of the House Judiciary Committee. I forget his first name, but it's Andrew Volstead. He's a representative, a congressman. Not sure what state he's from, maybe Ohio, I'm guessing. But anyway, so they wrote this up. It was first conceived by a member of the Anti-Saloon League, but then he's the one that brought it up and he thought, well, it's going to be a law. It's not going to be a big deal. He actually drank alcohol, but he thought everybody would abide by this, right? So what it was supposed to do is prohibit intoxicating beverages, and it defined it as 0.05, which many people were surprised because they thought that it was only going to ban hard liquor, not beer and wine. So that they thought this was really, really low. So there was a surprise for that. So it regulated the manufacture, the production, the use, and the sale of high-proof spirits and other beverage purposes, right? It was also they wanted to supply enough alcohol for medicinal reasons, for scientific reasons, for industrial reasons too. So it had to stipulate that, but it didn't define what an intoxicating beverage was, right? Now Wilson vetoed this, but Congress overrode his veto. So anyway, here's the impact. Right away, people didn't really think about this, but it decreased tax revenues for local, state, and at the federal level, right? And there was also an increased cost to enforce this law. A lot of businesses failed. A lot of restaurants depended on alcohol as a means of income when they're selling food and that sort of thing. And people just blatantly disregarded the law, as I talked about before. People had speakeasies, they had stills, they found ways to get it. So here's some of the ways right here. So you get criminal gangs that form as a result of this, and they become syndicated. They come together in different groups. They organize crime units. You also get bootlegging. This is people who illegally manufacture it, and then they sell and distribute it, right? So you get these souped up cars in many areas, and some people say, and I'm not sure if this is true or if it's urban legend, but this is the precursor to NASCAR. Sorry. But anyway, and also rum running. That's if you import alcohol from outside of the country. It doesn't have to be rum per se, but if you get it from our coastal areas or from the Great Lakes or across the Canadian border, some people got very, very wealthy off of this, right? Also, people had speakeasies. There was a guy, a German diplomat who came to the United States, I think it's on one of the videos that you watch, who said, well, when is this going to go into effect? And it had been in effect for several years, and the guy didn't notice it because there were all these speakeasies in New York City. So it was really easy to get. People disobeyed it. People bribe officials to be able to do that. The one good side of it, though, is alcohol consumption was down by 30%, and I've seen elsewhere where we get a lot of the diseases associated with alcoholism also decreased. All right, so we do get the organized and syndicated crimes, right? People who organize themselves into these networks where they have certain territory or terps, right? Where they fight against one another or they agree to terms with one another, right? You get organized activity across the Canadian border, as I said, and along the coast. In New York, the main crime family was organized by Lucky Luciano, and in Chicago, the main one was Johnny Torrio, but then that was turned over later. Johnny Torrio turned it over to his sidekick, Al Capone. He took that over for him. But when Al Capone took over, it became more and more violent, and probably the best example of that is the St. Valentine's Day massacre on St. Valentine's Day in 1929. Capone's men dressed up as policemen and they put the rival gang up against a wall not far from Michigan Avenue, I think like a block off of that, in this garage, and they just gunned them down. So this is Al Capone right here. He was worth millions of dollars, right? He was born in New York, and he kind of got into gang activity there. And then in his 20s, he moved to Chicago, and he was a bodyguard of Johnny Torrio, and he won over his trust. And then, so Torrio, after his life was in danger multiple times, then he decided to retire, and then he turned it over to Al Capone, or you say Al Capone, right? Because he had Sicilian connections in Italy. He was an Italian, second generation Italian. But anyway, he had a very close relationship with the mayor, with the local police of Chicago, so he didn't think anything would happen to him. But a special crime unit was created by the federal government that went after him and investigated him and eventually got him for tax evasion, right? It's estimated that he was worth about $100 million, which at the time was huge. So anyway, he was tried and convicted for tax evasion. He spent 8 years in prison, but his health was deteriorating. He had some form of syphilis. So anyway, he ends up, he's out of prison for a while. He dies at the age of 48 with a stroke. All right, this is Elliot Ness, this image right here. He's part of this Bureau of Prohibition that went after Al Capone. They're called the Untouchables because he screened the members of this organization so closely that they were not subject to bribe. They wouldn't be bribed, right? But anyway, so these are special agents of the Bureau who went after Capone and other people, and it was headed by him, Elliot Ness, right here. They sought out that corruption. right? Or they were not corrupt. They sought out others who did it. And the techniques that they used, the way that they organized themselves, the way that they were trusted officials is something that has really impacted law enforcement. They try to organize themselves in a similar manner. All right, so this is the last thing we're going to talk about, and that is the Great Migration and some of the impact that the 1920s had on African Americans. And you can see here are some people who are moving out of the South. They went to the West, they went to the North. They wanted to get out of the South, and mostly there's push-pull factors. They're pushed out of the South so they don't have to endure Jim Crow, black codes, oppression, the KKK, violence, lynching, all of that. But there are pull factors too, right? They want the opportunity to raise their children better. They want education. Most of all, what they want, though, are jobs. And those jobs are found in the industrial cities of the North. All right, so the Great Migration, here this is a huge relocation of millions of African Americans out of the South to other parts of the United States. And this goes between 1916 to 1970. 500,000 of them migrated during World War I, and then 900,000 in the 1920s. And as I said, there's push and pull factors. The main thing pushing them out of the South, they wanted to get out of Jim Crow South. Not only that, many of them, as you know, worked as sharecroppers, and things were not going well for them, right? There's increased mechanization, and so as a sharecropper, you're not needed as much because you're not doing the work by hand. The machines are doing the work instead. Also, farmers weren't prospering very much during this time period because a boll weevil, this bug, impacted the crop down in the South to the point where there's certain strains of that crop they will not allow you to plant to this day because it could be devastating, right? So anyway, they go north. They're seeking better opportunities. They brought with them their culture. You're going to see the spread of jazz and different aspects of African American culture that's going to spread throughout the United States, right? Racial tension, though, ensues when Black people and white people are living together in northern cities. And fortunately, we're going to get some instances of racial violence. Okay, one thing I wanted to put up here, I've talked about these before, I've told you these stories. This is a book that I've read that's really good. Isabel Wilkerson wrote it. I shouldn't really think much about it growing up. She grew up in the North somewhere, I'm not sure where. But her parents migrated out of the South, and they ended up meeting each other in the North. They were from very different regions. And she interviewed about 1,200 different people, basically auditioning them for her protagonists in this book. And so you could read the story, the narratives of three different people. Ida Mae Brandon, Glanny. She goes to Chicago. And really, it didn't turn out that great for her and her family. George Swanson Starling, he left Florida and he goes to New York City. And then Robert Joseph Pershing Foster, he was the one I was telling you about, who, when he was driving, and this was in contempt, I think I told you, driving from his home in Louisiana all the way to California, he pretty much had to drive nonstop because there was no place where a Black man could stay in a hotel or even park his car to sleep at night. So it was very difficult. So you feel empathy for these people when you read this story. So if this is something that you might want to do while you're in quarantine, this is a good book that I would recommend. Okay, so one of the results of the Harlem Renaissance, or of the Black migration, was the Harlem Renaissance. Here, when Black people go to a Black neighborhood in the North, they're free to express their beliefs, right? And they're free to, they start to develop economically, politically, and artistically. And you get this whole outpouring of African American art and literature, and performing art and that sort of thing. So here, for the first time too, mainstream publishers start to produce that, right? And more white people are reading it. One person who is very famous from this time period is Langston Hughes. He was a poet, a well-known poet, right? And he commented on the Harlem Renaissance. He's like, Harlem's in vogue, right? But one thing that he did is he urged other Black people to be proud to be Black. So you get this movement where Black people are urging racial pride. All right, we also get the creation, your book doesn't talk about this, but the creation of the NAACP. This came out of the Niagara movement that was begun by W.E.B. Du Bois, and Du Bois started the Niagara movement in response to Booker T. Washington, right? So he responded to that with an organization where they seek to gain equality in white society. So anyway, so they first had the Niagara movement, but then in 1908 there was this horrible riot in Springfield, Illinois, where two Black men were accused of assaulting a white woman. Turns out it never happened, but these Black men were in jail. And then there was a mob that went to the jail because they were going to take them. And then they found out the police had moved them to a different jail in another city. I'm not sure what city that might have been. But anyway, so a riot ensued, and white people rioted and they burned like the Black neighborhood of Springfield, Illinois. So after this incident, people were inspired to start a new organization. They founded the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, in New York City. Black people and white people were involved in that. Ida B. Wells was one of them, W.E.B. Du Bois, a white woman, Mary White Ovington, and many others who did this. But anyway, what they were seeking was complete racial equality and justice through the judicial system, through lobbying, and through peaceful protest. And we know that they've been quite successful, right? They spread their word, and they had different articles and writings through a magazine that's called The Crisis, which is still, I don't know if it's in print, but I know it's online today. So they had that. W.E.B. Du Bois was its first publisher. So they spread a lot of ideas from that. What's interesting is once people go to the North, they write things like this to kind of spread the word. And then the spark of the civil rights movement is going to begin. And then there are people like A. Philip Randolph, who was the head of the Railroad Porters Union. And what they would do is they would take these publications, and they're traveling all over the country on the railroad, and they would spread it throughout. Right. And so more and more people were reading about this, and more people feel like there is this solitude amongst them, this brotherhood, to where if they join together, they could affect change. And so this really, once we get the Great Migration out of the South, you start to see the beginning of what's going to become the civil rights movement. And you can see some early successes during this time period. Right, they were successful in bringing about a lawsuit, the NAACP was, which ended the grandfather clause in the South. This was a tool that was used in the South. If your grandfather could vote, then you don't have to take the literacy test. Well, white people's grandfathers all could vote, right? Black people's grandfathers could not. So black people had to take the literacy test, and white people did not. So they got rid of the grandfather clause. Also, they organized rallies, or actually boycotts, from throughout the country for Black people who also protested The Birth of a Nation, that movie. And then in 1917, they also did a silent march where 10,000 people in New York City did this march to protest lynching. So their voices are starting to be heard, and that's because of the organization of the NAACP. All right, but you also get the rise in Black nationalism. And the person who really started this movement towards Black nationalism that you're going to see with the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X, in the 1960s is this guy, Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey was actually born in Jamaica, but he came to the United States as an immigrant. And he created the Universal Negro Improvement Association. And what this was is an organization where he advocated, let's go back to Africa, right? He'd never been to Africa, but he kind of appointed himself the self-proclaimed president, provisional president of Africa, all of Africa, right? So it's kind of this Pan-Africanism, right? He allied himself with the KKK because both the KKK And this guy wanted black people and white people to be separate from one another, right? So he set up red flares, right? The government was fearful of him, so they went after him, but they didn't know what to go after him for. So eventually, they got him on mail fraud because he was selling stock in his company illegally, and he was ended up deported from Africa. But anyway, to look at bigger aspects of this, the main thing that he wanted was for black people to be independent of white people. That meant economically independent and everything else. So they had a lot of black owned businesses, including a steamliner, a ship company that went back and forth from Africa to the Americas. It was the Black Star Line. So they had all these different businesses, and they told black people only shop at black businesses to try to encourage that. But anyway, they have this conference, right? And they came up with certain things. This is the second main bullet there of the organization. They wanted to uplift the black race, encourage self-reliance and nationhood. They proclaimed that red, black, and green was the flag, the official banner of the African race. They, like I said, encourage black people only use black businesses. They own their own businesses, right? It was huge. By 1920, there were 1,900 different divisions in 40 countries. Most of these divisions, though, were in the United States. Sorry for how long this was. Anyway, thanks for listening. Talk to you soon. Bye.